Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff Perlman with Xojo, and I'm here today to talk about remote debugging. Remote debugging is one of those things where it's a solution when you really need it. Most of the time, regular debugging works just fine, but sometimes remote debugging is the solution, so it's a good thing we have it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics, and then we're going to get into some demonstrations. So let's get started. We're recording this session, so it'll be up on YouTube if you want to watch it later. If you want to send links to other people, post on the forum, whatever, it'll be there in perpetuity. And if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A panel in Zoom, and I'll try to answer them at the end. So as I go along, just stick them in there. We'll get to them at the end. All right. Well, like I said, I'm Jeff Perlman. I'm founder and CEO of Xojo, and I like talking about Xojo, so I'm here to do this webinar. And let's talk about debugging in general at first. There's a couple of things I want to make sure everybody understands about debugging. First is when you press run in the IDE and you're running from the IDE, it is a compiled app that it builds. Occasionally, we get people who seem to think that when you press run, it's somehow an interpreted app, and it's not. There's no interpreter in Xojo at all. So when you press run, it compiles the app, but it inserts into your app some debug code so that it can talk to the debugger in the IDE. So that's the difference between run and build. Run is basically building the app in pretty much exactly the same way, and you'll see in the demo what I mean by that, as it would if you hit build, but it does insert some debug code to talk to the IDE's debugger. Now, with that said, that means that if you have performance sensitive code, and it have to be really performance sensitive, you'd probably want to do your testing with a built app rather than in the debugger. Simply because that debug code does add some extra overhead. Depends a lot on what your app is doing. But if you really want to get the most, the best possible results, then you'd want to test in a built app. And don't forget about the optimizing compiler. Often when people are going to build, when a developer's building the app that they want to ship out, the optimizing compiler takes longer, so sometimes people forget to set that, and that's obviously going to give you the best performance if you up the optimization level. Of course, it takes longer to build, but you do get the best performance. Now, what I call sort of regular debugging, or everyday debugging, means you're running locally on your machine's OS. That's what regular debugging is. Whereas remote debugging is running elsewhere, running somewhere else. And that can mean several things. The most common is to run inside a virtual machine. That's what I'm going to show today. But less common would be running on another computer, in your office, let's say. Some users will have a Windows PC and another machine running Linux or a Mac or whatever, and they just want to run on a different machine, on a different OS running on that different machine. That's absolutely common as well. And the less common or least common is on another computer over the internet. Now, that's doable. It's a lot of effort, so that wouldn't be my first choice. If you had a client who was running an app and they were getting a bug and it only happened on their machine, I would still try to like put some code in your app, maybe build a special version or something, because it's a lot of trouble to get the packets all the way through. They're going to have to make changes to the router to allow the um, the connection and all that stuff. So you can do it. So if you need to do it, it is an option, but it wouldn't be my first choice if I was trying to solve a problem. Okay. So project types that work well with remote debugging. Desktop apps primarily, that's mostly what we use remote debugging for is desktop apps. And secondly, web apps. You can absolutely use the remote debugger with web apps. There's less of a reason to do that, but you can definitely do it. And of course, console apps, since web apps are basically console apps, but not iOS apps. They require the iOS simulator, so there's no remote debugging there. I suppose in theory there'd be a way that we could make it work. I'm not sure there's a huge advantage to that, but in theory, I suppose we could probably make it work. Same is true for Android. The Android requires the Android simulator, so there's no remote debugger for that. For those, you debug straight to the simulator. Okay, where do you find the remote debugger? It's an application. It's found in the extras folder, so you already have it. There's two. There's the remote debugger console, that's for web apps and console apps, and then the remote debugger desktop, which is for desktop apps, as the name implies. And this is a look at the extras or the remote debugger folder in the extras folder. You can see there's the console folder, then there's the remote debugger desktop folder. I've opened that up, and all of the remote debuggers are in there. The one for your machine is going to be unzipped. You can see in this case I'm on a Mac, so remote debugger desktop, that's unzipped, so I can just launch it right away. If you need it for a virtual machine that's going to run a different OS, grab the right one, get it over there, unzip it, and install it. But it's just a desktop app or a console app in the case of the remote debugger console. So whichever one's appropriate, get it over there, get it installed, and you'll be ready to go. Now, we're going to look at this in the demo, but I wanted to focus on some of the UI. This is the Remote Debugger desktop window. It shows the machine name, it shows the IP address, the default port that it's listening on, where it's going to download. Because essentially, what happens is when you tell it to run remotely, it builds the app, but then it sends the app over to the remote volume, whether that's a virtual machine or a whole other computer, and it needs to know where it's going to put that when it does so. And then it needs to know if you want to launch the application after receiving it. The reason you might not want to do that is if there's something you need to do before it launches, like maybe you need to move some files near it, or you need to make some configuration change. If you need to do that, that's fine. You would uncheck this checkbox, and then you just launch the application on the remote volume yourself. Just double click it like you would any application. Okay, so there's some settings in the remote debugger as well. You just go to the application menu or the file menu and choose settings. You can give it a name. You can assign a password if you don't want somebody else trying to remote debug it. If you know anyone else that's using Xojo and might want to play a prank on you, you might want to use a password. And again, here's where you can set where it's going to download to. You can choose which network. Generally speaking, the whatever is set by default tends to work, so you probably won't have to monkey with that. Same with the port. That's that port I'm talking about that has to be open if you're going to remote debug to a machine outside your network. And again, there's router stuff that needs to be changed. If you really need to do that and you have trouble, contact support and we can help you out. But otherwise, it's not an issue. So yeah, there's basic settings. Chances are the only things you're ever going to change in here are setting up the initial name and then a password if you're going to use a password. Okay, so that's a really quick overview. Now let's do a demo. We'll get into the demo here. So I'm going to switch over to Xojo. Okay, so I've got one of the examples open here, and I'm going to remote debug. Now I'm going to be remote debugging to Windows and Linux, and I'm going to do that with parallels, with a virtual volume. So I'm going to go over here and open up Windows 11. Okay, and I've already got the remote debugger running. Again, it's just a desktop app, and I've got an alias to it on my desktop on Windows. So there it is. And I'm going to switch back to Xojo. And you're not going to click run because that's going to run it locally. Instead, you're going to go to the project menu and choose run remotely. And I've got my two machines set up. Now, before I run this, I want to show you how those appeared. If you go over to your settings, and you go to debugging. This is where you set up your remote debug hosts. Basically, you click add. It can auto discover local machines, but otherwise, you just give it a name, whatever you want, IP address, password if you're going to use one, and click OK. So, and then they show up here. So I've got two set up. I've got my Linux and my Windows These are both virtual volumes, you know, running their parallels, virtual machines, I should say. Okay, so that's where they're set up. And this is something you set up once. These are settings, so this is not per project. Once you set this up once, you shouldn't have to set it up again. Now, once you've done that, go to Project, Run Remotely, and choose the machine you want to run to. So I'm going to choose Windows, and it's going to compile and run, and I'm going to switch over, and there it is. I got there just in time. So there's the app running, and you can see that it's working. It's doing everything it should normally do, and searching works, etc. Right? So this is a build, again, just like if you were pressing the build button. It just inserts some debug code like it does when you're debugging locally. But to give you an idea of how much this is like hitting the build button, if we go back, let's close that. We're going to go back to the IDE, and you'll see that all of my build settings here, each target has a build step. So it's copying the database file, and that's something that, of course, it's a build step, so it's only doing when it builds. So it really is building the application, and it's sticking that database in the built app and then sending the built app over to Windows in this case. So now let's do the same thing, but on Linux. I'm going to switch back to Parallels. Let's bring up Linux. Okay. And so now I've got Linux running, and there's the same remote debugger, the Linux version. It's otherwise exactly the same. And of course, it's written in Xojo. All right, so I'm going to switch back to the IDE. And this time I'm going to choose Run Remotely and choose Linux. And same thing, it's going to build, and it doesn't switch for you back to Parallels, so you got to do that yourself. When people are first doing this, they sit there wondering what's happening because when you run locally, you're used to your app coming up in front of you, but it doesn't do that when it's running remotely. All right, and there it is. And once again, there's the window, so we can see that it works. That means it copied the database over because it's using a SQLite database. And yeah, so that much of remote debugging is actually really straightforward. And it works just like you'd expect. So for example, if I go back and if we go to one of the buttons and let's put in a breakpoint and we're going to hit run. Oops. Yeah, not run here. We're going to run remotely. So let's run on Windows. And I'll switch over to Windows. Oops. Okay, and there's the app, right? And we have a breakpoint on the first line of this button. So I'm going to click the button, and there we are. There's the breakpoint. And I can now step through the code and see what's going on. And it's in all other respects, it's just like regular debugging. There really isn't, it's not complicated. You get it set up, you install the app, you set up your connection, and and that's it. Otherwise, it's very much the same. There's a advantage, or rather, there's a time where it might make sense to try to use remote debugging when you don't necessarily need to. First, it's great for testing, obviously. If you want to test your app on another OS than the OS that you develop on. Maybe you develop on Windows and you want to test on Mac, or you develop on Mac and you want to test on Linux, whatever. But there's a kind of a unique situation where you might want to do this anyway, even though you don't necessarily need to test on another OS. If you have an application that does anything with the activated event of a window, oftentimes debugging becomes a problem, or refreshing a canvas, because the interaction between the IDE and your app causes, the activated event fires because the IDE is coming to the front. So if you can if you can run remotely in a virtual machine or onto another computer, it allows your application to act completely independently in terms of window layering with the Xojo IDE. So that's a big plus to remote debugging if you find yourself in that circumstance. It's a situation where you might normally not think to use remote debugging, but it actually works pretty well for that. Okay, so otherwise, like I said, it's no different than regular debugging. You just got to get the application copied over to the right machine or virtual machine, launch it. Like I said, set up your settings. That all can be done very, very quickly, and you are good to go. So I'm going to switch back to Keynote here, and we're going to take some questions, if there are any. Let's see. Let me get the QA panel. There it is. Okay. All right. We got a couple questions. Edwin's asking, so running on iOS, running an iOS app on an iPhone from the IDE, is that considered remote debugging? Well, yes and no. I mean, in a way it is, but it doesn't use the remote debugger. So when you're running from the IDE and you're running directly to the hardware, running on your phone, it is kind of remote debugging, but again, it doesn't go through the remote debugger. He's asking, is there a workaround for getting all those provisioning profiles? That seems to be a hassle every time I need to test things. Yeah, there's no workaround for that. You really have to have your device set up. I know it's a pain. It has nothing to do with us. It's strictly just Apple's security. Uh, I think Apple has done a great job of making iOS very, very secure. But the downside to that is that you, as a developer, you encounter it more than a normal end user does. That's for sure. Um, Let's see, there was another one from Edwin. iOS has an option to run on a physical device. Yeah, that's kind of what we were talking about. When connected to via USB, and it does give me feedback in the debugger. Yeah, so you absolutely can run on hardware on both iOS and Android. And like I said, that is basically remote debugging. It just doesn't use the remote debugger application itself. So it is very nice though. I've done it on both Android and on iOS, and it's there are lots of. I know you have to set up the provisioning profiles and stuff for iOS, but there are. I think that once you get past that, the experience is much nicer than the simulator, in my humble opinion. Um, so yeah, so there's that. All right. I don't see any other questions, but we can certainly, this is going to be a quick webinar since it's on a very narrow topic. If there are any other questions on anything else, I'd be happy to take a few more questions since we've got a few minutes. So if you have a question on anything else, pop it into the QA panel real quick and I'll answer it. Okay, well, it looks like there aren't any more questions, so this is probably the shortest webinar I've ever done, but it is, like I said, on a very narrow topic. I really appreciate you coming. Again, this will be on YouTube. Let's get to the next slide. There we go. Yeah, so this will be on YouTube, and again, you can copy the link to other people or let them know if they want to watch it. It'll be there in perpetuity, like I said. And we do a webinar every month, so we'll have more coming. And if you have ideas for things you'd like us to do webinars on, contact customer service and they'll get that information to us. Um, oh, there is a comment from Tim. I'll read that real quick. He says, remote debugging is one of those cool Xojo features that I've never used. Can't wait to try it out. Thanks for the demo. Yeah, you know, uh, it is absolutely remote debugging is a feature where you might never have used it, but the moment you actually need it, you're going to be so thankful it's there. There are a lot of features in Xojo that are like that, where you rarely need it's like a good example is interfaces. Interfaces are a fairly sophisticated feature, but when you reach the point where you need a generic way to talk to multiple different classes, and you suddenly realize that you have a solution, you add an interface, it's just great that it's there. And remote debugging is like that. So I agree with Tim. It's a great feature. It's one of my favorites. Okay. Well, again, thanks for coming, everybody, and I hope we'll see you at the next webinar. Bye for now.